Okay, so welcome everybody. This year now part of the Personal Budgets webinar. My name's Scott Boyd. I work for the Mott MacDonald Pathfinder support team. And just to put this into context, everybody that's on the webinar today should have expressed an interest or a need for some further support in relation to personal budgets. The reason we're holding the webinar is because we simply don't have enough capacity to deliver one-to-one to each and every local authority that needs the support. So we're hoping to make better use of this technology going forward. This is the first one, so please do feel free to email any feedback to me afterwards at scott.boyd@mottmac.com, and we'll make the slides available afterwards. I'm joined today by a number of people. We've got Andrew Baxter from the Department for Education, who's the policy lead for personal budgets. Andrew's going to go through the regulations and some of the key highlights from the Code of Practice, and also be available for questions as a panellist. We've then got Nic Crosby from InControl. Nic worked as part of the Pathfinder Accelerated Testing Group, and he's going to talk you through the Personal Budgets toolkit that the group has produced and has recently been published. Nic will also be available for questions afterwards. We've then got Mike from Wigan, who are our National Pathfinder Champion for Personal Budgets. Mike's the Assistant Director for Children's Commissioning, and he's going to talk you through his experiences to date and what they've done in Wigan. We will then have opportunity for questions and answer session. If you do have any questions as we go along, please do submit them via the panel, and I'll talk through some housekeeping and how to work the webinar. So you should actually see a slide at the moment on the screen, and everybody will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the presentation. If you do need to make a question, please use the little button, the virtual hand, and if you just click that, you'll alert the facilitator, Laura, who will then know that she can unmute you and you can ask your question. Now, the session is going to be recorded, and it will be made available afterwards. And if anybody's having any difficulty with their connections, they can dial in via telephone. And if you just look at the screen now, you'll see the audio mode, and you can see that you've got mic and speakers and use telephone. You simply switch to the telephone button, dial in, put the access code in the PIN, and you should come straight back into it. So it's with this that I'm going to pass over to Andrew Baxter to start today's session.
Okay, thanks very much, Scott. Just like to sort of thank you all for dialing into this webinar. It's a bit of a first for me as well, I have to say. So I'm slightly nervous about doing this, but interesting times. I feel a bit like a DJ at the moment. Right, I'm going to do a very short presentation just to go through some of the highlights, mainly from the Code of Practice, but I'll also talk about the regulations, Special Educational Needs Personal Budgets Regulations 2014. They were actually approved by Parliament, and that's what we mean by when we say made, on the 24th of June 2014. They come into force on the 1st of September 2014, and you can see on the slides you have got a hyperlink to the government legislation website, and if you just type in that name, the search engine's very quick, you'll find those regulations on there. The regs sort of set out the legal framework for personal budgets under Section 49 of the Children and Families Act, but with a real focus on the rules governing direct payments for the special educational needs provision element of the personal budget. Across the piece broadly, they sort of place requirements on local authorities and partners for information, advice and support for personal budgets sort of very generally, and they set out when a personal budget can actually be requested by a parent or a young person. I'll touch upon that a bit more when we go into the Code of Practice. They also then go into more detail, as I say, around direct payments for special education provision, and they set out sort of people who can have a direct payment and how the decisions in relation to direct payment are made, including some of the things that anybody who's familiar with the pilot scheme will have seen, including some requirements of local authorities need to check in beforehand, some around vested interest of the child and appropriate usage, impacts on other service users, and around payment for money. They also set out the conditions of receipt that parents must agree to before they can have a direct payment, such as monitoring and review and sort of having a separate bank account. And also another point I'll touch upon in the Code of Practice, set out a statutory requirement for the local authority to secure the permission of a college, school or early years setting where that where that provision by a direct payment is to be used within the setting there. They also set out a bit more detail about some of the reducing and stopping of direct payments within there. We then go on to the Code of Practice, and I'm pleased to say the Code of Practice was approved by Parliament on the 29th of July, just ahead of recess. And in terms of personal budget, there's sort of 3 key chapters that I'll take you through. They take us through sort of from the strategic right through to the individual in the same way that the Code of Practice is written in relation to personal budgets. And again, Code of Practice, I'm sure you're all familiar, is available on the gov.uk website. So starting off with Chapter 3, if we go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so Chapter 3 is your joint commissioning chapter, very much working together across education, health and care for joint outcomes. The main paragraphs within that are 311 and then 338 to 339. And this is some of the statutory requirement in there that joint commissioning arrangements must include arrangements for agreeing personal budgets. And then we go in that they should develop, local authorities and their partners should develop and agree a formal approach to making fair and equitable allocations of funding, and should set out a local policy for personal budget. So that's the first mention. We have the local policy for personal budget. And we then flag some of the key steps that you need to do to undertake this agreement and the policy. So very much this is building on the learning of the Pathfinders, sort of what that accelerated testing group and the Pathfinder group have found have been the sort of key things we need to do around personal budgets, and really learning the lessons from the Pathfinders about doing this at a strategic level, not just at an individual basis and an ad hoc basis, really thinking strategically, being clear and understanding what you can offer now and very much what you can offer in the future around personal budget. So what identify and agreeing the funding streams and services for inclusion at the moment, and what infrastructure do you need to put in place immediately for that? What are the links between what you can make available for special educational needs, what you already have available around social care, and what's going on in your local area around personal health budgets? And again, absolutely crucial, learning from the Pathfinders and the individual budgets for disabled children pilot before that. What's the information, advice and support available to families to help them consider and take up and manage a personal budget? And we've seen, really importantly, from the individual budgets pilots, that actually we always hear accusations of personal budgets being something for the middle classes and the pushy, sort of the more articulate members of the public. But actually, with the right support, they are an option for all, and be a really powerful, useful tool for choice and control. And then, again, key learning from the Pathfinders here. How do we develop that pathway? Where does the personal budget fit within that pathway, in that needs assessment and plan development? What are the sort of person-centred approaches that we need to underpin that within there? So really thinking about workforce and cultural changes, not just the statutory changes within there. And again, actually, September is the starting point on what you've got available, but we need to be thinking longer term. So start thinking about the joint commissioning strategies. Yes, this is what we're offering now in September, but actually where will we go with our joint commissioning that will support greater choice and control year on year? And that's absolutely fundamental throughout the Code of Practice. You know, this is at the heart of the reforms. It's in there in primary legislation, ensuring children, young people and families are involved in decision-making processes, both at that individual, at that strategic level within that. Okay, then moving on to the next chapter, into the local offer. Yeah, so again, this is now building what we mean by a policy around personal budget. So the local offer, there's a statutory requirement, must include information about the option of having a personal budget. And it should include a local policy, again, produced with parents and young people, that provides that description of the services across education, health and social care that currently lend themselves to the use of personal budgets. What are the mechanisms of control for funding available? So that around the direct payments, around notional arrangements and third-party arrangements, and clear and simple statements about that decision-making process and how people can get personal budgets within there. And being, again, absolutely, this is really sort of important learning from the Pathfinders, and why we've changed from what we had in the pilot scheme is about this information is upfront for parents and families. It's a clear and transparent offer, so parents know reasonably what is available. And again, just underpinning that, the support that's available to help them manage a personal budget. Then we go on to Chapter 9. I'm not going to go through, that's on the next slide please, that we're not going to go through all of the bits in Chapter 9 because there's a whole section on personal budget. It contains sort of the real detail on the process, and I could take a whole hour of our time, not very usefully, sort of going through that. So just selected some of the key paragraphs that have developed, weren't perhaps in some of the earlier drafts, and some of the key points of the process. So some of these ones got 9.62 and 9.95 to 9124. So EHC plan section J details how the personal budget will support particular outcomes. Provision will be used for, including any flexibility in its usage, and sort of really important, the arrangements around direct payments and the needs and outcomes that need to be met within there. So it must be specified within there. Talking about the process there in the next bullet on the slide, the child's parent or young person, we've narrowed the point of where they have the right to request. That can be when the needs assessment has confirmed that a plan will be prepared, but the new entrants to the system have a right to request a personal budget at that point, or existing plan holders have the right to request a personal budget during a statutory review within there. And then, again, something about how the process will there. You look in paragraph 9.102, some very clear signals there about child's parent or young person should be given an indicative figure of funding that's likely to be required. But local authorities will be very clear that this figure is indicative, and that any final allocation must be sufficient to secure the agreed provision specified within the plan. And we can go on to the next slide, just picking out another couple more bits. Again, we've already picked up on section J of the draft plan. It's where all the personal budget details will begin there. Very clear conditions of receipt around that for direct payments, and you can include that within section J, especially when you're sending the draft plan out there within that. And again, the earlier points I mentioned in the regulation, where a direct payment is proposed for provision, you must secure that agreement of the early year setting school or colleges within there. And then finally, local authorities must consider each request for a personal budget on its own individual merit. So yes, you have policies that set out what is generally available, but it's not a blanket decision-making process. Each request must be considered its own individual merits. So some clear points around that, actually local authorities needing to be ready to have that sort of, be able to understand requests from families from the 1st of September, new entrants to the system, and have your decision-making processes up and running within there. And one of the things I just wanted to clarify around personal budgets that we put, sort of the final point I'll make before Nic comes in sort of with some of the practicalities, we're putting the latest implementation guidance, just to be clear that the personal budget is a sum of funding available for children and young people where it's clear that they need this additional provision above that available to most children and young people through local services. And it's something we've seen in a few of the templates and draft EHC plans that have been coming through to the department recently. I just really want to be clear that it's not the sum total of all the resources that are available to support a young person. So some templates we've seen the whole plan costed out and listed in section J. Well, that isn't really a personal budget. Section J should be really about that detailed explanation about where the family has choice and control, how they're taking that choice and control, how money will be used, spent and managed, and some very specific details whether people are actually taking the cash within there. So that's a very quick talk through the code, sort of thinking about the sort of what you need at a strategic level to have be ready from September and how that will need to grow over time, and also what responses you need to be ready, how to sort of respond to people on an individual level if and as and when those requests start coming in. And I'll hand back to Scott.
Yep, thank you for that, Andrew. I'm just going to pass over to Nic now from InControl. He's going to talk through personal budgets toolkit and some of the work of the accelerated testing group.
Okay, hello everyone. It's always the same. We've got 10 minutes to kind of talk about 2.5 years of work with the Accelerate group, so it's easy to get caught up in the detail. But this is just a very brief introduction to the toolkit. I think probably many of you will have had the news flash that came out from the Pathfinder team this morning with kind of a downloadable version of it. If not, I'm sure Scott can send one on at the end of this. But it's just saying that this toolkit's come out. It's probably the 3rd or 4th version of the information pack that's been provided by the Pathfinder team that's drawn on the work of probably 10 to 12 of the Pathfinders over the last 2.5 years, kind of struggling and testing out and trying out different ways of putting together a personal budget offer for the families that are taking part. and it's all based on really solid learning. So there's kind of a key number of things that need to be in place for September 2014. I think the key phrase on this, though, on this slide really is the one that says September 2014 is the start. There's a lot of concern that we encounter out there. InControl's working with probably about 60 different services now. There's a lot of concern that people feel they have to have a full offer in place for September, but I think the reality is that September's the start, and yes, there's 3.5 years of work to get from the start to where it's much more of a standard offer. So it's not about having everything up front and available as a personal budget, but it's just having some really clear information, and I think that's the main focus of the toolkit, or this part of the toolkit, is really thinking about how the information you provide and the key steps that you need to have in place as families start to make requests for personal budget. So next slide, please. So toolkit basically comes in draws on two sources. That's the information packs put together by the SEND Pathfinder team. They detail all sorts of stuff from work around resource allocation to thinking about high cost or placements for children with very complex needs, some information around health, commissioning work, all sorts of different kind of themed discussions and pieces of work that were taken forward by the group, and they also link to numerous different examples and have quite a large number of case studies attached to them. The second is a publication that InControl have written with SQW being the evaluators of the Pathfinder program, but also previous to that they led the evaluation of the government-funded individual budget pilots that started back in 2009. So we kind of put together everything that InControl's learned with what SQW's been learning and set out quite a comprehensive framework that's put some detail to thinking about the long-term introduction of personal budgets. So those are the kind of two key sources that we've used in this piece of work. Next slide, please. I put this in mainly because InControl will always take any chance possible to highlight the views of families, but also because I think this quote, you kind of see that this is echoed throughout a lot of the stuff either in the code or in the information pack around families and personal budgets. It's a really powerful statement made by a mother who's been managing a personal budget now for over 2 years for her son, and it really does, it explains really, if you're going to have anything in place for 2014 in September, it's that feeling of, right, okay, well, let's be transparent and honest about what we can do, and that families, as Lara says, may not always like what you're telling them, but at least there's that feeling of honesty that underpinning everything. So it's just a really important quote that if you're going to work with families through taking forward personal budgets, which is quite a challenging piece of work on its own, let alone the wider reform program, then that feeling of, like, look, this is what we can do, this is what we are able to do, and this is where we're going in the longer term is a really good starting point. So next slide, please. Just to echo that, the kind of key part of the toolkit, it really does headline the co-production, is right at the middle of this. I think all our work at InControl has grown from very strong work between a small group of families and social services when we started out 7 years ago, actually working this out together in a spirit of learning. It's obviously different when you've got a legal framework that comes into play with the Children's Act and the Code of Practice, but that co-production is absolutely vital, especially around personal budgets, and especially if people are going to get and realise some of the potential that they bring with them of having a very individually tailored support and very individually appropriate opportunities for their children. As part of that, we've kind of headlined two kind of key principles that make sense. It's that spirit of transparency, so that everybody understands how decisions are made. If you go back to Lara's quote, then you can see that that's about her feeling of, actually sometimes decisions have been made about my children behind closed doors, and immediately as soon as that happens, I get worried about what those decisions are. So that feeling of transparency underpinning things, let's just say what we can do, this is how we make decisions and involve you in that, could be around your allocation system. It might be around things that you can and can't do with personal budgets, but it's that feeling of like, let's just be transparent with people from the beginning. The other half of that is participation, that everybody who needs to take part gets the support to be able to take part, so that families can take part, young people who want to have their views expressed can take part. Obviously, these themes run right throughout the Code of Practice and the SEND reforms, but I think they're particularly important when you're taking forward such a new piece of work like personal budgets. Next slide, please. The kind of key part of the toolkit that we're putting out this time is really around thinking about what you need to have in that local offer for September. And obviously the local offer's got a huge amount of general information. I put in there, it's 9.96 is a statement that local authorities must provide information about personal budgets as part of that local offer. The toolkit really bases itself on, okay, well, if you're going to put information in the local offer, then that's going to mean you need a certain number of things agreed, policies agreed, statements agreed, ways of working agreed that families understand. So we set that out in some detail in the toolkit. It was the tool, this approach of thinking about personal budgets in the local offer came from the SE7 Pathfinder group originally, and they found it a really useful way of thinking through, okay, well, if we're going to put information out, then this is what that information needs to include, and if that information includes, then we're going to have to make some certain decisions about how we take this forward. So next slide, please. So the first part of the toolkit's around September 2014. There's going to be a set of frequently asked questions that accompany this, some of which may well come from discussion that we're going to have in 10-15 minutes. But we've already got building up a bank of frequently asked questions, so that's going to accompany this toolkit. We're now looking towards, okay, well, once we got to September 2014, how do we think more long term? And that's, I guess, is in particular when you start going back to the old, to the guide that we published last year around introducing personal budgets and using the common delivery model, which SQW pioneered when they were working with individual budget pilot sites. If you could click onto the next slide, please. And the common delivery model, sorry, I'm aware that I'm talking very fast, but that's always the way when you need to get everything into a short amount of time. But the common delivery model is a kind of overarching structure within which you can fit the whole management planning and the work program that's needed to take forward personal budgets. It was originally designed around social care, but it's just as applicable across health and across special educational needs. It gives you kind of 4 areas of work in terms of organisational work, engaging and involving families, setting up the infrastructure, and then thinking through safeguarding and risk. And that's not just risk management in terms of individual safeguarding instances for children and young people. There's a number of risks that the Accelerator group are very aware of, and one of those is where services haven't actually invested real time in solely in taking forward personal budgets. They've really struggled. Often you've seen areas where they've added the personal budget agenda on top of a whole other program of work that somebody's doing as a day job. One of the biggest risks we've seen is that means that actually very little gets done, because personal budgets isn't a small piece of work. I'm sure most of you listening to this already know that, but it's one of the things that we've highlighted, and it's certainly highlighted in the toolkit. As I notice it says on the bottom of the slide, there's a number of resources that we've designed alongside this common delivery model, and there's also a stock checklist against the local offer information, both of which can come out following on from this seminar. Next slide, please. And I think that's my slot. That's the cover of the guide. And if anybody wants to find out more about what we're doing at InControl, then please do email me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. We're now going to go on and get Mike Chew from Wigan, who's going to do his last of the presentations, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. Please do submit your questions as we go along, and we can answer them once we finish this presentation. It's over to you, Mike.
Good afternoon. Afternoon, everyone. My name's Michael Chew. I'm the Assistant Director for Children's Commissioning at Clinical Commissioning Group. Actually jointly appointed by the authority as the complex. That's good news. Okay, so I've a 10 to 15 minute presentation really based on our journey here in Wigan in relation to personal budgets, and it reflects the fact that we worked with the department and Mott MacDonald for the previous couple of years, for 2.5 years, as Nic said, as a pathfinder, and are now early adopters. What I would say in terms of this presentation is it very much reflects our learning through the process, which is still ongoing. We take a lot from sessions like this and learning that we can take from other areas. So this isn't by any stretch of the imagination us putting ourselves up as exemplars of best practice in all things personal budgets. I think there's a lot of learning that we can take from other areas too. So if you could move on to the first slide, please. I really start at the beginning of the Pathfinder, and this may well now be territory that many people are familiar with, and this slide really just reflects the feelings of a lot of families that were drawn out from the SEND Green Paper back in September 2011, and it describes a system really that at the time wasn't working. I think there was a feeling amongst families that we limited choice and control, that aspirations were low, that services were very segregated for people, and that the system was difficult to understand and bureaucratic. So obviously that set the direction of travel for the very challenging reforms that the Green Paper set out. Can you put the next slide up, please? So in terms of coming at this presentation and describing our journey, this was really our starting point, and I've tried to reflect on some of the areas of strength I feel that there are in Wigan before I go on to reflect on some of our successes and then some of our challenges and opportunities looking forward. So I think one of the things that I think we would reflect on was the local working culture. Partnership has always in this area been really robust between local authority and NHS services. In children's services, the basis for that really is the Children's Trust, and it was from the Children's Trust down really that our strategy was set in relation to SEND, which we've taken forward over the course of the last few years, and really our integrated commissioning model that contains commissioning responsibility for health, education and social care for children in the borough was really responsible for driving that strategy forward. And it also enabled us to align funding streams for the purpose of delivering that strategy. But from our point of view, our starting point really was very similar to most people, and we'd started in the NHS system to work on more care being delivered in the community, and have delivered on things like children's continuing care, and implemented a pathway for that area of work, and had really worked hard to develop our children's community nursing team. In the social care system, we had the legacy of aiming high in a number of direct payments that we'd already agreed with families. And we'd also undertaken a review of special schools. And I think for us that meant that we were very comfortable with the level of provision that we had in the borough, and were able to offer provision to most of our children and young people who have statements in schools that were close to our other services and situated in the borough. So all that created quite a robust context to take on some of the challenges that the reforms set. So could I have the next slide, please? And this really just covers our key areas of development. I think some of the things that both Andrew and Nic have alluded to are sort of present on this slide. There's obviously a need in the SEND reforms to develop education, health and care plans. So obviously in this area of work you need to think about where personal budgets sit within those plans. To deliver on personal budgets, there are a number of things that I'll come on to that you need to develop in terms of infrastructure. And also, I guess what was different about the about the SEND reforms in the Green Paper that we hadn't seen previously was that it seemed to be suggesting a far more integrated approach to services, and it seemed to be suggesting that personal budgets themselves should be integrated and that funding streams should be brought together for that purpose. So that was one of our key areas of focus. In addition to that, we got a very strong lead in relation to personalisation as a concept, and the idea that any work around personal budgets need to be bigger than a budget itself, and needed actually to consider how the entire workforce worked differently with children and their families. And critically, I guess as well, these last two bullet points, that we engaged parents in everything that we did. And going back to the slide that Nick showed about Laura, that we were completely transparent in terms of our offer to children and families that live in the borough by way of a really robust local offer. So could I have the next slide, please, Scott? So some of our key achievements to date I wanted to touch on. So at the moment we have 85 education, health and care plans in place as an early adopter, and on 16 of those plans we have personal budgets attached, and those personal budgets contain elements of education, health and care funding. So we've been able to bring funding streams together for that purpose, and we've got a small number that actually incorporate elements of all three. The feedback from families in relation to that locally has been a real eye-opener for us. The outcomes that we've been able to demonstrate have been very, very positive, and the feedback that we seem to have appears to suggest that people do really value having more choice and control over the services that they're able to access, and more freedom to think about how a package can be constructed. We have one example that's our most prevalent, whereby we were able to use education funding that sat with a school, healthcare funding and care funding, to bring together a package of PA support for a young man that historically had received his services very separately. And the confidence that that has given that family to step back from providing care to their son and allow him to independently access more opportunities in the community has even surprised us, to be honest. And that package remains to this day to be functioning really well. So there are that and other examples like it. And another real achievement for us, and this goes back to some of the conversations about a local offer, and I guess in our view many areas have struggled with this, and we feel we've reached a point with it now where we are very clear what our offer will be on the 1st of September, and we're regarding that as a big achievement. We're now able to say that families will be offered a personal budget if they are currently accessing, or they are deemed to be entitled to, children's continuing care, element 3 educational funding, or statutory support through children's services. So we're very clear now what our offer is in terms of personal budgets, and we thought that was a big success. We've also developed significant infrastructure. We've developed personal budgets guidance document. We are working on a resource indication model which contains a combined resource indication questionnaire, which is the only one of its kind nationally, which we're about to start testing. That's a tool that enables us to understand how much money we're able to offer families. We've commissioned a brokerage support service from one of our local children's charities, Wigan and Lee Embrace, and we've developed with Wigan and Lee Embrace a significant programme of training and development for our professionals to enable the reforms to be implemented. Again, with the healthcare system, we've also done a significant amount of work with local healthcare provision to begin to start to develop our offer around personal health budgets. So as I said, our statutory offer is our offer is in relation to continuing care at the moment. However, beyond that, there are some areas of additional testing. So we've also looked at offering personal health budgets for continence products, and also in a small number of examples, wheelchairs for families, where we've been able to agree that and where that's been workable in the individual circumstances of each case. We've also developed a multi-agency key working service to support families through the various different stages of the reforms, because we've accepted that would more than likely be a challenge. In addition to that, we've done a lot of work in terms of restructuring our parent engagement programme to ensure that parents are at the centre of everything we are doing, and shaping and informing that direction of travel. So that really summarises our achievements to date. So could I have the next slide, please? In terms of our challenges and opportunities, there are a number of these, and I've said right at the top there that implementing a system of personalisation and personal budgets in an economy does require whole system change. It does require professionals to work in a fundamentally different way with families and children. It requires you to embed a range of new functions and roles, because there are different requirements around governance and safeguarding that you'll need to think about. So, for example, in personal health budgets, we've had some detailed conversations recently about the role of the designated health officer and their rolling sign-off plans that contain personal budgets. In addition to that, we've had a number of conversations as well about how we coordinate training and development for personal assistants who are supporting families, and how we bring our local NHS provider in to fulfil that function, and that's still ongoing. That's no easy piece of work. But again, we also need to think about expanding our offer. So I was very clear about what our offer is locally, and then beyond that, we feel there are some additional areas of testing that we need to consider, just to really ensure that we're developing our strategy and that we are rolling out the full intentions of the reforms, looking forward 3 years, as Nic and Andrew were saying. But clearly it will remain a challenge about how we do that in a sustainable way. So our resource allocation system is critical to that, as is fully evaluating the impact of the work that we've already done. So we're very keen to, continue conversations with organisations like SQW, who are leading on the evaluation for the department. Again, market development's also critical. Provider services will need to function differently to make the infrastructure work for families. I've already talked about some of the things that that we've put in place. It's likely to require services beyond that to function in a different way. I mean, an example I can think of right away would be therapy services. How can we get therapy services providing some expert input into our creative support planning to support our brokerage service in identifying opportunities that might be available to families to use NHS funding in a different way. And also, again, just continuing to engage all stakeholders, families, providers, in ensuring that we've got all the resources in the borough fully behind the reforms. So the final slide, please. So just in summary, I mean, there is evidence locally that we've been able to improve children's experience of the care that we provide and their families, and some examples of improved outcomes for them. Definitely some examples that we've increased choice and control. Also, I think, but some of our learning would be that, the concept of personalisation and personalising the delivery of all services is as critical as providing a budget. I think I've said at the start, in terms of what some of the key levers for us were and that made some of this happen, would certainly reflect on the integrated commissioning model, an agreed strategy across partners as key enablers. But I would also say that expert advice is critical, particularly in terms of things like the resource allocation model. We've worked very closely with the national support teams, with InControl, and with other local authorities, just to make sure that we've that we've got our thinking absolutely aligned to best practice in that area, because it's probably far too big a piece of work to think about resourcing locally when that expertise actually exists in networks nationally. Also reflect on stakeholder engagement, again working closely with families and professionals. That has really influenced our direction of travel. So I said that we'd done some testing in relation to continence products. Those ideas came from talking directly to families in the borough. And I guess the last point there that I was making really was around workforce development. There are a number of different roles that need to be that need to either be recruited to or developed with the existing workforce. And I think the programs of training and development that you put in place, the work that you do with partners to think about certain functions being delivered in a different way to ensure that you are able to provide things like brokerage, for example, are really critical. But that really was the end of the presentation. Those are the summary of the things that I feel made it work for us here in Wigan. But that was it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. I'm just going to invite attendees now to ask our panelists any questions that they may have. This could be based on what you've just heard, or any sort of wider personal budgets questions. You can use the virtual hand if you want to alert us so that we can unmute you and you can speak, or you can type and send them through. I do have a couple here which I'll start with, and again just let me know if you've got one and we can let you chip in. So the first question I have is, can I use a personal budget for alternative therapies? And I'm going to pass that one over to Andrew Baxter from the DFE to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. We do get this one quite a lot in relation to various sort of therapies, especially sort of some of the things around autism in particular. It's one I hear a lot on the road. I think the key point on this question is actually to relate it back to what provision you'd be recording in the plan. So actually, if you would agree that this is appropriate provision to meet the need and it's appropriate to be in the plan, well then yes, it could be considered for a personal budget there.
Thank you for that. I've got another one. Is where are the examples of send personal budgets and what have they been used for? And I think I'll pass that one over to Nic from InControl. If you can give us some examples, Nic, of what people have used personal budgets for based on your experience.
Well, if it's the SEN side, I mean, there's a story that's been used a lot in a lot of toolkits and all of the information pack around Amy in West Sussex, where the funding was actually sitting with the school, and the school released the money that they had for the additional support that was being provided to Amy's mother, and Amy's mother now manages a combined budget that delivers joined up support between home and school. And the school and mother are both very positive about the changes that's meant. I think Mum's a lot happier and a lot more comfortable feeling her daughter's been looked after by people that she really knows, and the school are much happier because they feel that they can see the difference in the relationships. I feel, and I know that the feedback from the first review, the first annual review after they had that in place, was that all parties were saying everything had just completely changed, really, the dynamics, and it was the best review they'd had for a number of years. I think there's a list as long as your arm, and I know that one of the things on the list always kicks off makes people question the use of personal budgets. I think the most important thing is uniformly to be open to the very individual and the very creative ways of doing things. So the key thing, and it says it in the code very importantly, especially in section J, be very, very clear about how funding has been used to deliver outcomes and what those outcomes are, but actually be really open to lots of different ways that the funding can be used. So gym memberships, gym memberships, headphones, iPads. We can throw some controversial ones in around conservatories and camper vans. A lot of these have their roots in social care, as people can be familiar. There's a personal budget up in Oldham where a school actually manages a personal budget for a family around a young man, a young 15-year-old, and that means that the school actually offer a very consistent, joined-up group of people to support this young man across the school holidays as well as during the school hours. It's obviously a school that's seen this as an opportunity to manage a personal budget, where the family wanted a personal budget, they just didn't want to take on the direct payment. Mum and dad, well, especially dad, actually talks very much about feeling that there's a real feeling of family life come back into their life since getting this kind of consistency, and also knowing that the support was there and that the school was there backing them up. So there's a huge number of examples. There was 44 listed at one point on the Pathfinder sites. I think those have been changed a bit because obviously the flexibility and some of the things that people tried out to begin with didn't work so well over time. But people have really just yeah, I mean, there's any number. There should be another, I think there's probably about another 40 examples going to be launched with the Making It Personal piece of work that kids have been putting together, and they cover health, education and social care. So there's large numbers. The most important thing is, though, not being closed to different ways of doing things, as long as you're focused on actually achieving the outcomes that you've agreed are most important for the child.
Okay, thanks, Nick. It's Andrew here from the department.
Yeah.
I just want to give a quick plug to something that Nick has said there. Actually, it's an important thing about the Kids Making It Personal project.
Yeah.
That's 3 probably hopefully really useful products that will be coming out in relation to personal budgets. One, sort of advice for parents around personal budgets. Second one, advice a bit of the commissioners, which is a revision of a document they produced last year. So very much to commissioning for better personalisation and personal budgets. And the third, new strand to the project, looking at advice to providers in relation to personal budgets and helping to be personal budgets ready. So just a quick plug for that.
Okay, thank you. And actually, there's the examples that Nick has talked about there. They are available along with lots of other examples in the Pathfinder information packs, and they are on the Pathfinder website. So it's sendpathfinder.co.uk/info packs, and you can check those out. We've just had a question from somebody in the audience, from Sharon, and it's quality control in the marketplace. So can we, Nick, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, lots of different ways. I think one of the things they found in the adult world around personal budgets was, and it was came up big at a personalisation conference last autumn that Norman Lamb chaired, was around the a lot of adult services took forward approved provider lists, which is one way of doing kind of trying to ensure some quality, but there was a big movement of disabled people who found that very difficult, and it found that they were actually being used to preclude, stop choice. So I don't think there's such a big push for approved provider lists. If you look at what they've done up in Newcastle and elsewhere, they've actually invested heavily in families being able to link up and actually recommend providers. So there's a sort of quality checking coming from families and from people with learning disabilities in the case of in Newcastle. If there's issues around certain providers, then the local authority would know about those, and if they tend to crop up in people's plans, then there would obviously have to be some discussion with families who are citing a provider where a local authority has concerns, and that has happened. But I think once families are made aware that the local authority might have concerns around quality, then that can be something that's managed, and that's been the case. There are examples of where that's happened. In terms of where it's more direct payment support, so it's more about PAs, You'll see local authorities have got in place or starting to develop personal assistant training programs, so that they offer a kind of key set of skills for people wanting to get involved and offer their services as personal assistants. They also include CRB checks and DBS checks, so they can build up registers. I think that's very much in its infancy, that push in most areas, but the areas such as Gloucestershire and Essex and Newcastle, those that were involved in the individual budget pilots, have got much more established ways of doing that. So there's a number of different ways of looking through quality, from actually putting out training to develop a workforce of personal assistants, to building a kind of understanding of quality within the family environments, that families can talk about who's working well and what's not working, and also local authorities having a good eye on Ofsted and inspection, you know, that sort of information as to where there might be concerns around certain providers. All of them are examples, and all of them we can either direct you via the info packs that are on the SEND Pathfinder website, or via Scott if people follow up with Scott at the end of this webinar.
Okay, thanks, Nick. I think Andrew, you have something?
Yeah, I think it's also a point to come in, and I think it's also a related point on this, so fully support everything Nick has said there. But I think there's something also about the specificity in education, health and care plans. Yeah. If you're actually really sort of nailing that provision that's needed in the plan, it's then having the confidence that that provider that the family are choosing can deliver that, has the skill set to deliver what's needed in the plan. So it's a lot there about getting exactly the proper sort of outcomes and needs identified in the plan, and understanding the absolute skill set and provision that's needed to match it. And that could then expose where a provider won't actually meet the quality or the standards to deliver for the individual.
Okay, thank you for that. I have another question that's come in, and this is really probably for Mike and Wigan. It's how have other local authorities approached the calculation of unit costs for SEN, social care and health? Now, I know both Wigan and SE7 are national champions, so they have done a lot of work around this, and it is very complex. But I think if Mike's available just to give a couple of points on that, that would be probably quite valuable.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Scott. Right, that's quite a difficult one in some sense. It would depend why you were doing it. I mean, the approach we've taken is not to unit cost all services. If people are interested purely in methodologies for unit costing, in relation to other pieces of work, we have done it. That's only really overlapped with our work around personalisation in relation to our short breaks, our internal short breaks provision in social care. So we do have a unit costing methodology. If people would, people would like us to share that, we can do so. The purpose of doing it in relation to this area of work is really linked to the development of our resource allocation system, and it was really to look at what price point we would pick for that provision if we were going to offer families a personal budget instead of that provision. So we needed to understand specifically what that costs in order to do so. But that was the only core service linked to our PB offer, and in social care where we've done that. In fairness, I say the only. What we have also done, which is similar, because it is unit costing, is then linked to the NHS system. So in the NHS system, what we've utilised is something called NHS reference costs, and we worked with our community healthcare provider to utilise NHS reference costs, which is a unit cost for all services, to enable us to strip out the cost of a particular input from us. And we looked at utilising that in therapy services, and also we utilised a similar approach, worked with our community healthcare providers, accountants, in relation to continence products and wheelchairs, where we identified the costs of particular items and we're able to move that over to people by way of a personal budget. In confidence, it was based on their likely usage, which was pulled through from the care plan.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. Okay, so we've got another question here, and it is, have you any examples of personal budget policies? I think I can probably answer that one. So as part of our role as the Pathfinder support team, we work with Pathfinders and also indirectly with local authorities, and we're constantly collecting any sort of examples of good practice. And that does extend to personal budget policy, so we're currently looking at these. We have got some of them in, but they're still in the process of getting an internal approval before they can be shared. And we're also doing a session in the northeast of England this week on how to actually develop the policy. So hopefully there'll be some key outputs from that. So unfortunately nothing at the moment, but there will be some stuff published in the not too distant future, i.e. the next number of weeks, hopefully. We have one final question before we draw the session to a close. And I think it's, again, this is for Mike, and it's basically Mike, what key lessons would you give to people when starting out in general with personal budgets?
Yeah, I've been asked that one before. It's 'cause I understand why people are asking. I guess it feels like it's difficult to know where to start in some senses when you do first set off. I think last time I was asked it, the answer I gave was that it's really critical to have an agreed and joined up strategy across a number of different partners before you sort of set sail. Really, we benefited from getting some really good leadership from our local children's trust that sets off on a direct travel. I said in the presentation, didn't I, that we looked at integrated personal budgets in particular, and not everybody did that, but we got a really strong lead in that direction. And I suppose the way in which we went about it enabled us to access a lot of different expertise that was in the borough, because there was a joined up strategy there and an agreed approach. So that was important. I think as well, talk to, engage with and listen to other people. That's, definitely, local families. So think about how you can link in with your parent participation teams and your, the patient engagement functions that sit within your CCG, within your NHS provider trust. But also listen to and work with professionals in your local economy too. And I guess then finally we've also benefited, like I said, from working very closely with expertise that really exists nationally, and bouncing ideas off people who are working with other authorities nationally. So, the national support teams in particular, but and working with people like Mott MacDonald and listening and having facilitated conversations with people who are doing similar pieces of work. That's been absolutely critical for us. So I think they would be three key things I'd do in principle. And I suppose the other thing that I always say too is that we benefited enormously from saying that we would do some testing in relation to personal budgets based on our existing eligibility criteria for services, and not wait until we had a resource allocation system in place, because that is a particularly challenging piece of work. So there would be a danger of not having tested anything in relation to other things we absolutely need to do that have been discussed today. But I'd say those four things would be a good steer.
That's very, very useful. I did say this was the last question, but I have one final question through. And again, apologies, Mike, I do have to direct this at you based on your practical experience. The question is, how did you manage the difference in expectations / eligibility for personal budgets between children's services and adult social care?
I think to some extent, Scott, that remains a challenge for us. So we continue to work closely with adult services locally, and share our work with them. But in our work, we haven't looked at anything that changes existing eligibility frameworks for services. So some of those challenges that exist in relation to transition do remain, but you can only hope that through the reforms themselves, the fact that we've, for this group of young people, our responsibilities are extended to the age of 25 when they're still in education, that provision in the statute, and I suppose the integrated way in which we are now working with families and supporting them in a different way, can only help improve that journey for them. But I wouldn't say that we, by any stretch of the imagination, that we've answered all the difficult questions that there are about transition. And I guess the hope is that that the new processes will continue to bring some of those challenges to light and enable us to have a greater insight into how we resolve them working with families.
Yeah, no, thank you. So as you say, it's about the integration and transparency, and actually working in the true spirit of the reforms will help with that. But by no means have you got through it all. So now that's quite useful to know. Okay, so thank you for that. I'm going to draw the webinar to a close now. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I hope you found it useful, and I do welcome any feedback. Please just email it through to myself, or feel free to give me a call. This is the first one, hopefully of many, but that will depend on the feedback. And finally, I'd like to extend thanks to all our presenters for giving their time up today. So Nic, Mike and Andrew, thank you very much, and I will draw to a close.